My name is Leroy Cantrell, and this all went down in July of 2009. I remember it clearly because it was a hot, sticky summer, and I was behind the wheel of my old Freightliner, hauling a load of steel beams to a construction site in southern Missouri. I'd been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, and you'd think I'd seen it all. But what happened that day still haunts me. I was rolling down Highway 60 somewhere between Poplar Bluff and Van Buren, in the middle of nowhere. There's this stretch of road that cuts through the Mark Twain National Forest. Beautiful during the day, but desolate and eerie once the sun goes down. That evening I was making good time, planning to stop at a truck stop near Springfield to grab a bite and catch some sleep. I just crossed over the Black River when I noticed a beat-up old pickup on the side of the road, hood up, and a guy waving frantically. Now truckers have an unspoken code: you help each other out. So I slowed down, pulled over, and hopped out to see what was up. The guy was maybe in his late 40s, scruffy beard, wearing a greasy baseball cap and a stained flannel shirt. He looked like he'd been working on that truck all day. "Hey man, need a hand?" I called out, walking over. "Thank God you stopped," he said, looking relieved. "I'm Ray. Truck just up and died on me. Think it's the alternator. Any chance you could give me a ride to the nearest town?" I sized him up. He seemed harmless enough, and I couldn't just leave him stranded. "Sure, hop in," I said. "Nearest town's about 20 miles up the road." Ray grabbed a small duffel bag from his truck and climbed into the passenger seat. We got moving again, and he was a talker. Told me he was from Alabama, heading up to visit his sister in St. Louis. Said his truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but he'd been hoping to make it just a bit further. We were maybe 15 minutes down the road when I noticed a car in my rearview mirror tailing us pretty close. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just someone impatient with my speed. But then it stayed right on us, which was weird given we were the only two vehicles on the road. "You know that car?" I asked Ray, nodding towards the mirror. He turned to look and his face went pale. "Nah, no idea who that is," he said, but his voice wavered. "Maybe it's a cop," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. "You running from the law, Ray?" He forced a laugh. "No, nothing like that." But I could tell something was off. I kept an eye on the car, which followed us for another 10 miles, never once trying to pass, just tailing us like a shark. When we hit a stretch where the forest thickened on either side, it finally made its move. The car sped up, swerved around us, and cut us off, forcing me to brake hard. "What the hell?" I muttered. The car stopped dead in front of us, blocking the road. A tall, thin guy in a dark jacket got out and started walking towards us. He had a gun. "Stay calm, Ray," I said, my heart racing. I reached under my seat, but I remembered I'd left my pistol at home. Company policy had recently cracked down on drivers carrying weapons, and I'd decided to play it safe. The guy reached my door and yanked it open. "Out of the truck," he ordered, pointing the gun at my face. I glanced at Ray, who looked terrified. "Look, we don't want any trouble," I said, raising my hands. "Take whatever you want." "I said get out of the truck," he barked. We did as we were told, climbing down slowly. Ray stumbled, almost falling. The guy motioned us to the side of the road, keeping the gun trained on us. "Empty your pockets," he said. We handed over our wallets, phones, and keys. "You can take the truck, man," I said. "Just let us go." "Shut up," he snapped. He took our stuff and tossed it into the car. Then he walked back to us, his eyes darting nervously. "You," he pointed at me, "get in the truck and start it." I glanced at Ray, who looked like he might pass out. "Don't try anything," the guy warned, jabbing the gun in my direction. I got back into the cab and turned the key. The engine roared to life. The guy motioned for Ray to get in the car. "You drive," he ordered me. With Ray in the car and me in the truck, I had no idea what his plan was. But I wasn't about to argue with a gun. I started driving again, following the cars that led the way down the highway. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The car led us down a narrow dirt road off the highway, deeper into the forest. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but there was no way out. The trees closed in around us, and I knew we were heading into a trap. Finally, the car stopped in a small clearing. The guy got out, still holding the gun, and walked over to my door. "Turn it off," he said. I did. "Out," he ordered again. I climbed down, my hands trembling. He motioned for me to follow him into the woods, where Ray was already being led by another man I hadn't noticed before. This one was shorter, stocky, with a mean look in his eyes. "Move," the first guy said, prodding me with the gun. We walked for a few minutes until we reached an old, abandoned cabin. My gut twisted with fear. They pushed us inside, and I saw it was empty, except for some old furniture and trash. "Sit," the second guy said, shoving Ray onto a dirty couch. I sat next to him, trying to think of a way out. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The first guy smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a little insurance," he said. "Make sure you don't go running to the cops." He turned to his partner. "Get the rope." I felt a cold sweat break out as the second guy rummaged through a bag and pulled out a length of rope. They tied us up, wrists and ankles, and left us on the couch. "Don't go anywhere," the first guy said with a laugh, and they walked out, closing the door behind them. As soon as they were gone, I started struggling against the ropes. "We have to get out of here," I whispered to Ray, who was shaking uncontrollably. "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not if we get out first," I said, trying to sound confident. I wriggled my wrists, trying to loosen the knots. It was slow, painful work, but I could feel the ropes starting to give. We heard the car start up and drive away, leaving us in the eerie silence of the forest. "Come on, damn it," I muttered, finally getting one hand free. I quickly untied the rest and turned to help Ray. "Leroy, thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "Save it for later," I said. "We need to move." We stumbled out of the cabin, looking around. The car was gone, and there was no sign of the two men. "Which way?" Ray asked, his eyes wide with fear. "We follow the road," I said. "It's our best chance." We started walking, keeping to the edge of the road, ready to dive into the trees at the first sign of trouble. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the forest. I kept my ears open, listening for any sound of the car returning. After what felt like forever, we heard the faint sound of a vehicle approaching. "Hide," I hissed, dragging Ray into the underbrush. We crouched down, holding our breath as the car drew closer. It wasn't the same car. This one was a beat-up old sedan, and the driver looked like an older man, probably a local. I stood up, waving my arms. "Hey, over here!" The car slowed down and stopped. The driver rolled down his window, looking at us suspiciously. "What's going on here?" "Please, we need help," I said. "We were carjacked and kidnapped. Can you call the police?" The man looked us over, then nodded. "Get in. I'll take you to the sheriff's office." We climbed into the back seat, exhausted and relieved. The man introduced himself as Earl, and he drove us to the nearest town, a small place called Ellington. At the sheriff's office, we gave our statements describing the two men and what had happened. The sheriff, a grizzled old-timer named Frank, took our story seriously. "We'll get a patrol out there to look for your truck and those men," he said. "You two are lucky to be alive." Ray and I exchanged a look. We were alive, but shaken to the core. The sheriff's deputies drove us back to the clearing where they found my truck, abandoned but otherwise untouched. There was no sign of the men or Ray's pickup. "Stay alert," the sheriff said as we prepared to leave. "These guys might come back." We thanked him and got back on the road, heading to the nearest truck stop. We needed to call our companies and report what had happened, but more than that, we needed to get some rest. As we drove away, I couldn't help but think about how close we'd come to dying out there. I'd always considered myself a tough guy, but this experience had shaken me. Ray was quiet, staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. We parted ways at the truck stop, exchanging phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. I never saw him again, but I think about him every time I pass through southern Missouri. That night changed me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the dangers out on the road. I still help people when I can, but I'm always on guard, always ready for the unexpected. And every now and then, when I'm driving through the dark stretches of highway, I remember those two men and wonder if they ever got caught, if they're still out there looking for their next victim. But I don't let it consume me. Life goes on, and so do I. After all, the road never stops calling, and there's always another load to haul, another destination to reach. And as long as I'm behind the wheel, I'll keep moving forward no matter what. That's the life of a trucker. My name is Clarence Hicks, and this happened to me on October 5th, 1994. I was a truck driver, hauling loads across the country for over 20 years. I'd seen my share of strange things on the road, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. I was driving through the dense forests of Oregon, somewhere along a remote stretch of Highway 199. The road was dark and winding, and the only light came from my truck's high beams cutting through the thick fog that clung to the trees. I had a load of lumber in the back, headed for a construction site in Medford. It was a quiet night, no other cars on the road, and my radio crackled with static, unable to pick up any stations out there in the boonies. I'd left my hometown of Klamath Falls earlier that evening, a town where everybody knew everybody. My wife, Linda, had packed me a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. She always worried about me, but I told her it was just another routine trip. I never thought twice about it. I'd done this route a dozen times. I was about 2 hours into my drive when I noticed a flicker of light up ahead, just off the road. It looked like a campfire, which was odd considering how remote and dangerous this area could be. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to pull over and check it out. I figured it might be some campers needing help, or worse, someone in trouble. I grabbed my flashlight and hopped out of the cab, the chill of the night air biting through my jacket. As I got closer to the light, I realized it wasn't a campfire. It was a single lantern hanging from a tree branch, swinging gently in the breeze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't put my finger on what. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight around. "Anyone here?" No answer, just the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I took a few more steps forward, and that's when I saw it. A tent, half collapsed, with scattered belongings strewn about. It looked like whoever had been here left in a hurry. I should have turned back right then, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I moved closer, my flashlight beam dancing over the mess. There were clothes, a couple of backpacks, and an old beat-up cooler. Then I saw it, a small, blood-stained sleeping bag. My stomach turned. I radioed into the dispatcher, but all I got was static. I cursed under my breath. This far out, the signal was spotty at best. I decided I'd have to drive to the next town and report it. As I turned to head back to my truck, I heard a faint noise, like a whisper. "Help!" I froze, straining to hear. It came again, a little louder this time. "Help me!" I followed the sound, moving past the lantern and deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse of movement up ahead. I quickened my pace, pushing through the underbrush until I came upon a clearing. There, lying on the ground, was a young woman. She looked like she was in her early 20s, her clothes torn and dirty, her face bruised and pale. She was alive, but barely. Hey, it's okay, I'm here to help," I said, kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open and she tried to speak, but her voice was weak. "He's still out there." I didn't wait to hear more. I picked her up as gently as I could and carried her back to my truck. Every rustle and crackle of the forest seemed louder, more menacing. I felt like we were being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. I got her into the passenger seat and grabbed the first aid kit from behind my seat. Her injuries were bad, but not life-threatening. I cleaned her wounds as best I could and gave her some water. "What happened to you?" I asked. She took a deep breath, wincing with pain. "We were camping, my boyfriend and I. Then this guy showed up. He had a knife. He killed my boyfriend. I managed to get away, but he chased me. I thought he was going to kill me too." My blood ran cold. There was a killer out here, and he could be watching us right now. I needed to get us out of there. I started the truck and peeled out of there as fast as I could, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The woman, whose name I learned was Emily, sat hunched in the passenger seat, her eyes wide with fear. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes, until we reached the outskirts of a small town. I pulled into a gas station and rushed inside to call the police. The clerk looked at me like I was crazy, but he handed me the phone. "Hello, 911. What's your emergency?" I quickly explained the situation, and they said they'd send someone out immediately. I went back to the truck to check on Emily. She was still shaken, but she managed to give me a weak smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved my life." The police arrived within minutes, and I gave them my statement. They took Emily to the hospital, and I followed them in my truck. I wanted to make sure she was okay. The next few hours were a blur. I answered questions, filled out paperwork, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The police told me they'd found the campsite and the body of Emily's boyfriend. They were launching a manhunt for the killer, but in those dark, dense woods, it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. I stayed in town for a couple of days, helping the police with their investigation. They combed through every detail, trying to piece together what had happened. Emily was released from the hospital, and she stayed at a local motel under police protection. I called Linda to tell her I'd be home late and briefly explained what had happened. She was worried, of course, but she understood. She always did. The news of the murder spread through the town quickly. It was all anyone could talk about. People were scared, locking their doors and windows, keeping their kids inside. The police increased their patrols, but there was no sign of the killer. On the third day, I was ready to head back home. I stopped by the motel to check on Emily one last time. She looked better, though the fear was still evident in her eyes. "Thanks again, Clarence," she said. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "Just take care of yourself, okay?" I said, giving her a reassuring smile. "And stay safe." As I drove away from the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The killer was still out there, somewhere in those woods, and the thought of him made my skin crawl. I kept my eyes on the road, my mind replaying the events of that night over and over. A week later, I got a call from the police. They'd found the killer. He was a drifter, living off the grid, moving from place to place. They caught him hiding in an abandoned cabin deep in the forest. He didn't put up a fight, just smiled when they arrested him. The smile of a man who enjoyed the fear he'd caused. I thought I'd feel relief, but all I felt was a hollow emptiness. A young man was dead, and Emily's life was forever changed. I went back to my routine, hauling loads across the country, but I couldn't shake the memories of that night. Every dark stretch of road, every flicker of light in the distance brought it all rushing back. Linda noticed the change in me, of course. She'd always been able to read me like a book. One night, as we sat on the porch, she took my hand in hers. "You did everything you could, Clarence," she said softly. "You saved that girl's life." "I know," I replied, staring out into the night. "But it doesn't feel like enough." Time passed, and the memories faded, but they never truly went away. I stayed on the road, always moving, always looking ahead. But every now and then, I'd think about Emily and the fear in her eyes, and I'd wonder about the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men. Years later, I heard that Emily had moved away, started a new life somewhere far from Oregon. I hoped she'd found peace, that she'd been able to move on. As for me, I kept driving, kept hauling loads across the country, trying to outrun the shadows of that night. And maybe, just maybe, one day I'd find a stretch of road where the memories couldn't follow, where the darkness couldn't catch me. But until then, I'd keep moving, 1 mile at a time, hoping to leave the past behind. My name is Clyde Harper, and this happened to me on a chilly October night back in 1993. I was driving my rig through the back roads of West Virginia, heading toward a little town called Hinton. It's a quiet place, one of those spots where you can drive through and not see another soul for miles. I had a load of lumber to drop off, and the deadline was tight, so I decided to push through the night. The road was narrow and winding, the kind of route that keeps you on your toes. I'd been driving trucks for nearly 15 years, and I'd seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing prepared me for what was about to happen. I'd stopped at a small diner earlier that evening to grab a quick bite and fuel up. The place was almost empty, just a couple of locals chatting in the corner, and an old waitress who looked like she'd seen it all. As I paid my bill, she gave me a look and said, "You be careful out there, trucker." Roads get tricky this time of night. I just nodded and smiled, thinking she was referring to the usual hazards like deer or black ice. Back on the road, the night seemed to stretch on forever. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the dark, and the hum of the engine was my only companion. I turned up the radio to keep myself awake, a mix of classic rock and country tunes filling the cab. I was halfway through Freebird when I saw it, a car, an old beat-up sedan parked on the side of the road with its hazard lights blinking. Now, I'm not the kind of guy to leave someone stranded, especially out in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and grabbed my flashlight, stepping out into the cold night air. The car looked like it had seen better days, with rust spots and a cracked rearview mirror. As I approached, I noticed the driver's door was open, but no one was inside. "Hello?" I called out, shining my light around. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the road. I walked around the car, but there was no sign of anyone. It was eerie, to say the least, but I figured maybe they'd gone to find help or were hiding out in the woods. I decided to check the car to see if there were any clues about the owner. Inside, the car was a mess. Fast food wrappers, empty soda cans, and a torn map of West Virginia on the passenger seat. The keys were still in the ignition, and a purse was lying on the floor. I felt a pang of unease. Something wasn't right. I pulled out my cell phone, but there was no signal. Typical for these parts. Just as I was about to head back to my truck, I heard a noise, a rustling in the bushes nearby. I turned my flashlight towards the sound, my heart pounding. "Is someone there?" I called out again, but there was no response. I took a few steps closer, the beam of light shaking in my hand. That's when I saw her. A woman, her clothes torn and her face streaked with dirt and blood, stumbled out of the woods. She looked like she'd been through hell. "Help me," she whispered, barely audible. I rushed to her side, supporting her as she nearly collapsed. "What happened?" I asked, but she was too weak to respond. I needed to get her to safety. I half-carried, half-dragged her back to my truck and got her into the passenger seat. Her breathing was shallow and she looked terrified. As I started the engine, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "He's still out there," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't stop, just go." I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas and sped down the road, my mind racing. Who was she talking about, and what had happened to her? I glanced at her, trying to keep her awake. "What's your name?" I asked. "Molly," she replied weakly. "Molly Jenkins." "All right, Molly. I'm Clyde. We're gonna get you some help, okay? Just hang on." I drove as fast as I could, the tires screeching on the curves. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something chasing us. But there was nothing but darkness. We reached a small gas station about 20 miles down the road. It was one of those 24-hour places with a couple of pumps and a flickering neon sign. I pulled up and ran inside, startling the clerk, a young guy with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap. "I need help. There's a woman in my truck. She's hurt," I said out of breath. He grabbed the phone and dialed 911 while I went back to the truck to check on Molly. She was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived and the paramedics took over. They loaded her onto a stretcher and into the back of the ambulance. One of the paramedics, a woman with a no-nonsense attitude, turned to me. "You did good bringing her here. We'll take it from here." I watched as they drove off, the red and blue lights disappearing into the night. I was left standing there, the cold air biting at my skin. I went back into the gas station where the clerk was hanging up the phone. "Sheriff's on his way," he said. "You okay?" "Yeah, just trying to figure out what the hell happened," I replied. We waited in silence until the sheriff arrived, an older man with a stern face and a weathered look. He introduced himself as Sheriff Thompson and asked me to recount everything that had happened. I told him about the car, the woman, and her warning about someone being out there. He listened carefully, taking notes. "We've had reports of a missing woman, fits her description," he said. "You did the right thing bringing her here. We'll get to the bottom of this." A few days later, I was back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept thinking about Molly and what she had gone through. I decided to stop by the sheriff's office on my way back through Hinton to see if there were any updates. Sheriff Thompson greeted me with a nod. "Clyde, good to see you. We've been looking into the case. Molly Jenkins was reported missing by her family 2 days before you found her. She's recovering in the hospital, but she's still pretty shaken up." "Did she say what happened?" I asked. "She's mentioned a man who attacked her, but she's too traumatized to give us a clear description. We found her car where you said, but no sign of the attacker." I left the sheriff's office with more questions than answers. The whole thing didn't sit right with me. Over the next few weeks, I found myself driving through that stretch of road more often, hoping to spot something, anything, that might shed some light on what happened. But there was nothing, just the same dark, winding road. Months passed, and the memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the routine of long hauls and delivery deadlines. I never saw Molly again, but I often wondered if she had managed to piece her life back together. One night, about a year later, I was parked at a truck stop in Tennessee, chatting with a few fellow truckers over coffee. The conversation turned to strange encounters on the road, and I found myself recounting the story of Molly Jenkins. One of the guys, a grizzled old-timer named Pete, listened intently. When I finished, he leaned back and took a sip of his coffee. "You know, I heard something similar happened over in Kentucky. Woman found wandering the road, all beat up. Said she was attacked by a man, but they never caught him." A chill ran down my spine. "You think it's the same guy?" "Could be," Pete said with a shrug. "A lot of bad folks out there. We see more than most driving these roads." That night, as I climbed into my cab and settled into the sleeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, the man who hurt Molly was still lurking, waiting for his next victim. I made a vow to keep my eyes open and my guard up, ready to help if I ever came across another soul in need. As truckers, we're the lifeline of the country, crisscrossing the land, often unseen and unnoticed. But we see things, hear things, and sometimes we're the only ones who can make a difference. I never found out what happened to Molly's attacker, but I hoped that one day he'd slip up and get caught. Until then, I'd keep rolling, my eyes scanning the dark roads ahead, ready for whatever might come my way. Because out here, you never know what's waiting around the next bend. My name is Ellis McNair, and this all went down on October 17th, 1994. I've been a truck driver for over 15 years, seen all kinds of strange things out on the road, but nothing like this. I was hauling a load of lumber from Duluth, Minnesota to some small town in Kansas, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked. It was a usual route, and I knew every pit stop and diner along the way. The day started like any other, with a quick breakfast at Fran's Diner just off the interstate. Fran made the best damn pancakes, and the regulars would always shoot the breeze, talking about everything from the weather to the latest Packers game. I liked the familiarity of it all. After breakfast, I hit the road. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that feels like it could rain any minute. I was making good time, planning to stop for the night in a little town called Birchwood. I've stopped there plenty of times. It's got a decent motel and a bar where they serve cold beer and hot burgers. About halfway through my trip, I realized I was running low on gas. My usual stop was another hour away, and I didn't want to risk it. There was a sign for a gas station in some small town called Roper's Creek, just 5 miles off the main highway. I figured I'd fill up there and grab a coffee. The turnoff led me down a narrow 2-lane road lined with thick trees. It was the kind of place where you'd think twice about getting out of your truck at night. As I approached the gas station, I noticed it looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and one of the windows was boarded up. But the pumps looked functional, and that's all I needed. I pulled in, got out, and started filling up. The place was deserted. No cars, no people, nothing. Just the quiet hum of the pump and the occasional rustle of leaves. I walked inside to pay, and a bell chimed as I opened the door. The inside was just as rundown as the outside. Dusty shelves, flickering fluorescent lights, and an old man behind the counter who looked like he hadn't moved in years. "Morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. He grunted in response, not even looking up from his newspaper. I handed him a 20 and told him to keep the change. He barely nodded. I grabbed a coffee from the self-serve pot, which tasted like it had been sitting there since the Reagan administration, and headed back to my truck. That's when I saw her. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, walking towards me. She was barefoot, wearing a dirty white dress that looked like it had been dragged through the mud. Her hair was a mess, and she had this wild look in her eyes. "Help me," she whispered, looking over her shoulder as if someone might be following her. "Please, you have to help me." I glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out of the trees. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "They're after me," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "They killed my friend. They're going to kill me too." I didn't know what to say. It sounded crazy, but the fear in her eyes was real. I opened the passenger door of my truck. "Get in," I said. "I'll take you to the police." She climbed in without another word, and I hopped into the driver's seat. As I pulled out of the gas station, I noticed the old man watching us through the window, his expression unreadable. We drove in silence for a few minutes. I kept glancing over at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What's your name?" I finally asked. "Alice," she said, still looking out the window, her body tense. "Alice, I'm Ellis. We're heading to Birchwood. There's a police station there. You'll be safe." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. I didn't blame her. Something about this whole situation felt off. I reached for the CB radio, planning to call ahead, but she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she said, her eyes wide. "No police. They're in on it. You can't trust anyone." Now I was really confused. "Who's after you, Alice?" She took a deep breath, her eyes darting around the cab of the truck as if she was looking for hidden cameras. "There's a group," she said slowly. "They take people. They use them for, I don't even know, experiments, sacrifices, whatever. My friend and I, we were just passing through. We stopped at that gas station. They got her, but I escaped." Her story sounded like something out of a bad movie, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. I decided to keep driving towards Birchwood, but now I was more alert, constantly checking the mirrors for any sign of trouble. We were about 10 miles out when I saw the headlights in the distance, coming up fast behind us. "Alice, you need to hide," I said. "Get in the back, cover yourself with the blanket." She didn't argue, climbing into the sleeper cab and pulling the blanket over herself. The headlights got closer, and soon a black SUV was tailgating me. I tried to stay calm, keeping my speed steady, but the SUV started flashing its lights, honking its horn. "Ellis," Alice's voice came from the back. "They found us?" I floored the gas pedal, the truck's engine roaring as we picked up speed. The SUV matched our pace, and I knew it wouldn't be long before they tried something more aggressive. The road was empty, not a soul in sight, just miles of darkness stretching out ahead of us. Suddenly, the SUV swerved, ramming into the side of the truck. The force of the impact nearly sent us off the road. I struggled to keep control, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Another hit, this one harder, and the truck started to skid. I saw a dirt road up ahead, a narrow path cutting through the trees. It was a gamble, but I took it, hoping the truck could handle the rough terrain better than the SUV. The truck bounced and jolted, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness. The SUV followed, but I could hear the sound of branches scraping against metal, the engine struggling to keep up. We drove for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. The SUV finally fell back, its headlights disappearing into the night. I kept going until I saw a clearing up ahead. I pulled into it, killing the engine and the lights. "Stay quiet," I whispered to Alice. We sat there in the dark, listening for any sound, any sign that they were still following us. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound our heavy breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally exhaled. "I think we lost them," I said. Alice emerged from the back, her face pale but determined. "We need to keep moving," she said. "They won't give up that easily." She was right. I started the engine and we carefully made our way back to the main road. The rest of the drive to Birchwood was tense, every shadow and distant headlight making me jump. We arrived just before dawn, the sky turning a pale shade of pink. I pulled into the parking lot of the police station and turned to Alice. "Stay here," I said. "I'll go inside and explain everything." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. I walked into the station, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. The officer at the desk looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" I quickly explained the situation, leaving out the more unbelievable parts. He listened, his expression growing more serious. "We'll take it from here," he said, motioning to another officer. "Where's the girl?" "In my truck," I said, leading them outside. Alice was gone. The passenger door was open, the blanket discarded on the seat. "What the hell?" I muttered, looking around the empty parking lot. The officers exchanged glances, their hands moving to their holsters. "We'll find her," one of them said. "You did the right thing coming here." I spent the next few hours at the station, giving my statement, filling out paperwork. They assured me they'd look into it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Alice was right. There was something off about this whole situation. I left Birchwood later that morning, my mind racing with questions. Who were these people? Why were they after Alice? And what happened to her? A few days later, I heard on the news about a body found in the woods near Roper's Creek. They didn't release many details, just that it was a young woman. My heart sank, knowing it was probably Alice's friend. I kept an eye on the news, but there were no updates. No arrests, no further information. It was like the whole thing never happened. Years went by, and I couldn't forget about Alice. I'd see her face in my dreams, hear her voice whispering for help. I kept driving, kept to my roots, but I was always looking over my shoulder, always wary of the dark roads and empty gas stations. I never saw Alice again, and I never found out what really happened. But every now and then I'd hear about another missing person, another strange disappearance. And I'd wonder if it was all connected, if there was some dark truth lurking just out of sight. Maybe it's all just paranoia. Maybe it's just the ramblings of an old trucker with too many miles on the road. But I know what I saw, and I know that out there, somewhere, there are people who know the truth. And they're not talking. I still stop at Fran's Diner when I'm passing through. The pancakes are still great, and the regulars still talk about the Packers. But now I listen a little closer, watch the faces of the strangers who come and go, because you never know. You never really know. And that's my story. Believe it or don't, but keep your eyes open out there. You never know what you might see or who you might meet on those long, lonely roads. My name is Wade Fletcher, and this happened to me on November 7th, 2003. I've been driving trucks for nearly 15 years, crisscrossing the country hauling anything from livestock to electronics. It's a solitary life, but it suits me just fine. I like the open road, the silence, the time to think. This time, though, I got more than I bargained for. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Kansas City to Denver. The route took me through miles of open plains and the occasional small town. It was late, past midnight, and I was somewhere in eastern Colorado. The highway was empty, just a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark. I pulled into a small truck stop to get some coffee and stretch my legs. The place was a dive, just a single pump and a diner that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the 70s. I parked my rig and went inside. The bell above the door jangled as I entered, and a bored-looking waitress glanced up from behind the counter. "Just coffee," I said, and she nodded, shuffling off to pour a cup. There were a couple of other truckers in the booths, but they were minding their own business. I took my coffee to go and headed back out to the truck. As I was walking back, I noticed a beat-up old van parked near the entrance. A man was leaning against it, smoking a cigarette. He gave me a nod, and I nodded back, not thinking much of it. I climbed back into my cab, set my coffee in the cup holder, and checked my route on the map. I was about 2 hours from my next stop, a way station just outside of Lyman. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. About 20 minutes later, I noticed headlights in my mirror. They were coming up fast. At first, I figured it was just another trucker or maybe someone in a hurry to get somewhere. But then the lights got closer and closer until they were almost on top of me. I glanced in the mirror and saw that it was the same beat-up van from the truck stop. It stayed right on my tail for a few minutes, then pulled out to pass. As it went by, I saw the driver, a rough-looking guy with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He glanced over at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He sped up and disappeared into the night. I shook my head, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. It was probably nothing, just some guy in a hurry. I focused on the road and kept driving. About an hour later, I needed to take a leak, so I pulled off onto a rest area. It was one of those isolated spots with just a couple of picnic tables and a restroom. I parked and headed over to the restroom, flashlight in hand, since the place was only dimly lit by a single flickering light. As I was finishing up, I heard a noise outside, like footsteps crunching on gravel. I froze, listening. The footsteps got closer, and then I heard a low murmur of voices. I turned off the flashlight and waited, my heart pounding. The voices got louder, and I could make out two men talking. They sounded agitated. I peeked out the door and saw the beat-up van parked next to my truck. The driver was there, along with another guy, tall, wearing a hoodie. They were looking at my truck, pointing and talking in hushed tones. I stayed hidden, not sure what to do. After a few minutes, they got back in the van and drove off. I waited until their taillights disappeared before coming out of the restroom. I quickly got back into my truck, locked the doors, and pulled out of the rest area. My mind was racing. Who were those guys? What did they want with my truck? I drove straight through to the way station, not stopping for anything. When I got there, I told the officer on duty about what happened. He looked at me like I was crazy but took down the details anyway. After that, I kept an eye out for that van. I didn't see it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I made it to Denver without any more incidents, delivered my load, and headed back home. A couple of weeks later, I was back on the road, this time headed to Amarillo. The memory of that night had started to fade, but I was still a little jumpy. I was driving through another stretch of empty highway when I saw something up ahead, flashing lights. As I got closer, I saw it was a police roadblock. I pulled over, and an officer came up to my window. "Good evening, sir. We're looking for a vehicle that might have been involved in some criminal activity. Have you seen anything unusual tonight?" I shook my head. "No, officer, just the usual late-night traffic." He nodded and handed me a flyer. "If you see this van, give us a call." I took the flyer and glanced at it. My blood ran cold. It was the same beat-up van. I nodded and put the flyer on the seat next to me. The officer waved me through and I drove on, my mind racing. What were the odds? I decided to pull over at the next truck stop and call it in. I found a payphone and dialed the number on the flyer. A gruff voice answered and I gave him the details, where I saw the van, the description of the driver. "Thanks for the tip," the voice said. "We'll look into it." I hung up and got back in my truck, feeling a little better. Maybe now they would catch the guy and I could stop looking over my shoulder. A few days later, I was back home taking a break from the road. I was sitting on the porch enjoying a cold beer when my phone rang. It was the officer from the roadblock. "Mr. Fletcher, we found the van you reported. It was abandoned in a field about 20 miles from where you saw it. We also found something else. There was a body in the back. Looks like it had been there for a while." I felt a shiver run through me. "Do you know who it was?" "Not yet. We're running prints and dental records, but we wanted to let you know. Thanks for your help." I hung up and stared at the phone. A body. In the back of that van. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was it? How did they end up there? And why was the driver so interested in my truck? I never got the answers to those questions. The police never called back and I didn't follow up. I went back to driving, but I was more careful, more aware of my surroundings. I avoided late-night stops at isolated rest areas and kept my doors locked at all times. Life went on, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Every time I passed through that stretch of highway, I couldn't help but think about the van, the driver, and the body. It was a reminder that no matter how much you think you know the road, there's always something out there waiting to surprise you. Years later, I was still driving, still making my way across the country one load at a time. I heard stories from other truckers about strange encounters and close calls, but none of them seemed to match what I had experienced. It was a reminder to stay vigilant, to never take anything for granted. One night I was sitting at a truck stop diner in Arizona talking with an old friend, Bill. We'd been driving together for years, and he knew about my run-in with the van. "You ever hear anything more about that?" he asked, sipping his coffee. I shook my head. "Nope. Police never followed up, and I didn't push it. Figured it was better to leave it alone." Bill nodded. "Probably a good idea. Some things are best left in the past." We sat in silence for a while, watching the other truckers come and go. The road can be a lonely place, but it's moments like these that make it bearable. Sharing stories, looking out for each other, and remembering that no matter how vast and empty the highway may seem, we're never truly alone. As I finished my coffee and headed back to my truck, I couldn't help but glance around, checking for any sign of that old van. It was a habit now, a part of my routine. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was just good sense. Either way, it kept me alert, kept me alive. And as I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, I knew one thing for sure. I'd never forget that night, and I'd never stop being careful. Because out here on the road, you never know what's waiting around the next bend. My name is Randall Bergman, and this happened to me on August 13th, 1986. I was a long-haul truck driver, hauling freight across the country. I drove a beat-up Kenworth W900, and my route took me through some of the most desolate parts of the United States. This time I was headed from Memphis to Albuquerque, a long, lonely stretch of road that I'd driven more times than I cared to count. I'd been on the road for about 10 hours and was making good time. The CB radio crackled occasionally with the usual chatter from other truckers, but mostly it was just me and the hum of the engine. I'd planned to stop for the night in a small town called Tucumcari, New Mexico. I liked the place. It had a decent truck stop, and the folks there were friendly enough. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the flat, arid landscape. I'd just passed through Amarillo and was pushing on when my truck started acting up. It began with a slight shudder, then a loud bang, and before I knew it, I was coasting to the side of the highway. I got out, cursing my luck, and popped the hood. The engine was steaming, and it didn't take long to figure out that my radiator hose had blown. I was stranded. I grabbed my toolbox and flashlight, but I knew it was a lost cause. I didn't have a spare hose, and the nearest town was miles away. I got back in the cab and picked up the CB mic, hoping to catch a friendly voice. "Breaker 19, this is Roadrunner. Any of you good buddies got your ears on? I'm broke down just west of Amarillo. Over." I waited, but there was nothing but static. I tried again. Still nothing. I sighed and leaned back in my seat. It looked like I was spending the night right there. I made myself as comfortable as I could and closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest before dealing with my situation in the morning. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I heard the knock. It was a light tapping on my window. Groggy, I sat up and looked out, expecting to see another trucker or maybe a Good Samaritan. Instead, I saw a man standing there, silhouetted by the moonlight. He was tall and thin, wearing a dirty baseball cap and a tattered jacket. I rolled down the window just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Need some help?" the man replied, his voice raspy. "Yeah, my truck's busted. You got a phone or anything?" The man shook his head. "No phone, but there's a gas station a few miles back. I can give you a ride if you want." Something about him made me uneasy, but I didn't have many options. "All right," I said reluctantly. "Just let me grab my stuff." I climbed out of the truck, grabbing my flashlight and toolbox. The man watched me with an unsettling intensity. We walked over to his car, an old beat-up sedan that looked like it had seen better days. I got in the passenger seat, and he started the engine. The interior was filthy, and the air reeked of stale cigarette smoke. We drove in silence for a while, the darkness of the desert enveloping us. I kept my hand on my flashlight, ready to use it if things went south. After about 10 minutes, I realized we weren't heading back toward Amarillo. The gas station should have been in the other direction. "Hey," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "I think you're going the wrong way. The gas station's back that way." The man didn't respond. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something was very wrong. "Listen, man, I appreciate the help, but I think I'll just walk back," I said, reaching for the door handle. But before I could pull it, the man locked the doors with a click that echoed through the car. "Stay put," he muttered. "We're almost there." "Almost where?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned off the highway onto a dirt road. The car bumped and jostled as we drove further into the middle of nowhere. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. I could try to overpower him, but he was bigger and probably stronger. I could wait for an opportunity to escape, but who knew when that would come? Finally, the car came to a stop in front of a dilapidated cabin. The windows were boarded up and the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The man got out and walked around to my side, opening the door. "Out," he said, his voice cold. I hesitated, then stepped out of the car, keeping my flashlight close. "What is this place?" I asked, trying to stall for time. "Shut up and move," he growled, shoving me toward the cabin. Inside, the place was even worse. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. The man pushed me into a corner and tied my hands behind my back with a piece of rope he pulled from his jacket. My mind was racing, trying to figure out a way out of this. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to a table and picked up a rusty knife. My blood ran cold as he approached me, the blade glinting in the dim light. I knew I had to do something, and fast. "Please," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "I've got money. I can give you whatever you want." The man smirked, the first sign of any emotion I'd seen from him. "It's not about money," he said quietly. "It's about making you suffer." Before I could react, he lunged at me, the knife slashing through the air. I managed to twist to the side, the blade cutting into my arm instead of my chest. Pain shot through me, but I didn't have time to think about it. I kicked out with my legs, knocking the man off balance. He stumbled back, giving me a moment to act. I struggled to my feet, my hands still bound behind me. I ran for the door, but he was on me in an instant, tackling me to the ground. We grappled, the knife inches from my face. I could feel his hot breath on my skin, the smell of sweat and tobacco overwhelming. With a burst of adrenaline, I managed to roll us over, pinning him beneath me. I brought my head down hard, smashing it into his nose. He grunted in pain, and I felt his grip on the knife loosen. I wrenched it from his hand and plunged it into his chest. He let out a strangled cry, then went limp. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding. Blood was everywhere, and the reality of what I'd just done hit me like a freight train. I had to get out of there. I ran out of the cabin, my hands still bound, and made my way back to the car. I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the doors. I drove as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I made it to a gas station just outside of Amarillo, my arm throbbing from the wound. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor. The attendant called the police, and within minutes I was surrounded by flashing lights and sirens. They cut the rope from my wrists and bandaged my arm before taking my statement. The man I killed was identified as Daniel Parker, a drifter with a long history of violence. He'd been linked to several disappearances in the area, and it was clear that I was supposed to be his next victim. The police found the cabin, and inside they discovered evidence of his other crimes: clothes, personal items, and even a few bones. I was cleared of any wrongdoing, but the experience haunted me. I left trucking a few months later, unable to shake the memories of that night. I moved to a small town in Oregon, far from the highways and the nightmares that plagued me. I never forgot Daniel Parker, or the fear I felt in that cabin. Life goes on, they say, but some scars never fully heal. I'm grateful to be alive, but every now and then I wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of his cold eyes staring into mine. It's a part of me now, a dark chapter in my life that I can't erase. My name is Bruce Sutter, and this happened to me on July 17, 2003. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, and I've seen my share of strange things on the road. But nothing prepared me for what went down that summer. I was hauling a load of lumber from Boise, Idaho to a small town in northeastern Nevada called Wells. It's not a big place, but it's got a charm of its own. This route was familiar, a routine job I'd done countless times. The drive through the high desert was always peaceful, the kind of solitude I enjoyed. Gives you time to think. I started the trip early, aiming to make good time and maybe grab a bite at this diner in Wells I liked. Just a regular day, no sense of anything off. I remember joking with the dispatcher, Chuck, about making it in time for the diner's lunch special. "Bruce, if you don't get that meatloaf, I'll take it myself," Chuck said over the radio. We both laughed and I hit the road. The drive was uneventful for the first few hours. The sun was bright, the sky a perfect blue. The road stretched out before me like a ribbon, nothing but sagebrush and the occasional rabbit. Around midday, I noticed a beat-up old Chevy pickup ahead of me, weaving slightly as if the driver was having trouble. I slowed down, figuring they were either drunk or distracted. As I got closer, I saw it was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a wild shock of white hair. He glanced at me in his side mirror and then swerved to the shoulder, letting me pass. I gave a friendly honk as I went by, but he didn't acknowledge it. I thought it odd, but didn't dwell on it. A few miles down the road, I needed a break. There's this small rest stop near the border, nothing fancy, just a place to stretch your legs and use the facilities. I pulled in, parked my rig, and stepped out. The heat hit me like a wall, and I headed straight for the shade of the lone picnic table under an old cottonwood tree. I was sitting there, sipping on a Coke, when I saw the same old Chevy pull into the lot. The old man got out, moving stiffly. He had this look on his face, hard to describe, but it wasn't right. He walked over to the vending machines, fumbled with his wallet, and then just stood there, staring at the machine like he couldn't remember what he was doing. I decided to check in on him. "Hey there, you all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned to me, and for a moment his eyes looked clear and sharp. "You heading south?" he asked, ignoring my question. "Yeah, down to Wells," I replied. "Need any help?" He shook his head. "Just be careful out there. Strange things happen in these parts." With that cryptic warning, he climbed back into his truck and drove off, heading back the way he'd come. I shrugged it off as the ramblings of an old man and finished my break. The rest of the drive to Wells was uneventful, and I made it just in time for the diner's lunch special. The meatloaf was as good as ever, and I spent a couple of hours chatting with the regulars, catching up on local gossip. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to get a head start on the return trip. Heading back north, the sun started to dip, casting long shadows across the desert. There's a stretch of road just past Wells that cuts through a narrow canyon. The walls rise steep and jagged on either side, and the road twists and turns like a snake. It's a beautiful spot, but it can be tricky, especially as the light fades. I was about halfway through the canyon when I saw something on the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man, lying in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The rig came to a screeching halt just a few feet from him. Jumping out of the cab, I ran to the man. He was unconscious, a nasty gash on his forehead. I recognized him immediately. It was the old man from the rest stop. I checked for a pulse, and he was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and he was bleeding badly. I ran back to the truck to grab my first aid kit and radio. "Chuck, we got a problem," I called in, my voice shaky. "Found an old man on the road, looks like he's been attacked. I need an ambulance." Chuck's voice crackled back, tense. "Where are you?" "In the canyon about 15 miles out of Wells." "Sit tight, Bruce, I'll get help on the way." I returned to the old man, doing my best to stop the bleeding. As I worked, I heard a noise behind me, a crunch of gravel. I turned, and there he was, the attacker. He was a big guy, maybe 6'4", with a shaved head and a crazed look in his eyes. He didn't say a word, just came at me with a knife. I barely had time to react. I grabbed a tire iron from the truck and swung it, catching him on the arm. He grunted but didn't slow down. We struggled, the knife flashing in the fading light. I managed to knock it out of his hand, but he tackled me to the ground. He was strong, stronger than he looked, and he had this wild animalistic strength. I fought back with everything I had, but he was relentless. Just when I thought it was over, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The sound seemed to give me a surge of strength, and I managed to land a solid punch to his jaw. He stumbled back, and I scrambled to my feet. The attacker glanced toward the sound of the sirens, then back at me. For a moment, I thought he'd come at me again, but then he turned and bolted, disappearing into the rocky terrain of the canyon. I didn't follow. My first priority was the old man. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, along with a couple of sheriff's deputies. They took over caring for the old man, loading him onto a stretcher and whisking him away to the hospital in Elko. One of the deputies, a grizzled guy named Sheriff Logan, took my statement. I told him everything that had happened, from the rest stop to the attack. He listened, nodding occasionally, his face grim. "Sounds like you had a close call," he said when I finished. "We'll get a search party out, see if we can find this guy." I spent the next few hours at the sheriff's office, going over my statement again and again. By the time they let me go, it was past midnight. I was exhausted, but too wired to sleep. I parked my rig in a lot behind the sheriff's office and tried to catch a few hours rest. The next morning, I went to the hospital to check on the old man. His name was Walter Gray, and he was still unconscious, but stable. The doctor said he'd lost a lot of blood, but would likely pull through. I left my number with the nurses, asking them to call me if he woke up and wanted to talk. I spent the rest of the day in Wells waiting for news. Sheriff Logan called me in the afternoon. No sign of the attacker. They'd found the knife, though, and were running prints. That night, I decided to head back home. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, but there was nothing more I could do. As I drove, I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them. A few days later, I got a call from the hospital. Walter was awake and asking for me. I drove back to Elko, anxious to hear what he had to say. When I walked into his room, he looked up and smiled weakly. "You saved my life," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just glad I was there," I replied, sitting by his bed. "What happened to you?" Walter's eyes clouded over and he took a deep breath. "I don't remember much. I was driving through the canyon when my truck broke down. That man, he came out of nowhere, attacked me, took my wallet, and left me for dead." "Do you know him?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. He shook his head. "Never seen him before, but there was something in his eyes, like he enjoyed it, like he'd done it before." We talked for a while longer, but he didn't have much more information. Just a random act of violence, a reminder of how unpredictable life can be on the road. I kept in touch with Walter for a while after that. He recovered slowly, but the experience left its mark. As for me, I went back to my usual routes, though I was more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers. A few months later, I got a call from Sheriff Logan. They'd caught the attacker in another county, trying to rob a convenience store. He confessed to several attacks on travelers in remote areas, driven by some twisted need for violence. I didn't feel any sense of closure, just relief that he was off the streets. Life went on, as it always does, but that summer stayed with me. It was a stark reminder that even in the vast emptiness of the desert, danger can be just around the corner. Driving through the canyon now, I sometimes think about Walter and the attacker, about how our paths crossed in such a brutal, random way, and I keep my eyes open, always scanning the road ahead, ready for whatever comes next. My name is Otis McAllister, and this happened to me on November 15th, 2008. I was a truck driver, crisscrossing the United States, hauling goods from one corner to the other. Life on the road was mostly uneventful, long stretches of highway and endless hours of solitude, but every now and then, something happens that shakes you to your core. I was on a run from Wichita, Kansas to some small town in Montana I'd never heard of. The load was a mixed bag, industrial supplies mostly. I had been on the road for about 7 hours and was looking for a place to take a break, somewhere I could grab a bite and maybe stretch my legs. I spotted a little truck stop just off the highway near some place called Loma. Seemed like as good a place as any. The place was nearly empty when I pulled in. A couple of other trucks were parked, and there was an old Ford sedan by the diner. I parked my rig, locked up, and headed inside. The diner was straight out of a different era, with red vinyl booths and a counter lined with stools. A middle-aged waitress with a name tag that said Bev looked up from behind the counter and nodded as I took a seat. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please," I replied. "And a burger if you got one." She scribbled on a notepad and slid it to the kitchen window. The cook, a burly guy with a stained apron, grunted and got to work. I was halfway through my burger when a man walked in. He was tall, with dark hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in weeks. His clothes were worn and dirty, like he'd been on the road longer than I had. He took a seat at the counter a few stools down from me. Bev walked over to him. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," he said, his voice low and gravelly. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I finished my meal, paid my tab, and headed back to my truck. As I walked across the lot, I noticed the man had followed me out. He was standing by the Ford sedan, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off and climbed into my cab. I decided to push on for a few more hours before stopping for the night. I pulled out of the lot and back onto the highway, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. Sure enough, the Ford pulled out behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. About an hour later, I saw the blue and red lights of a police cruiser flashing in my mirror. I pulled over, thinking it was just a routine check. The Ford pulled over too, a little way behind me. The officer walked up to my window. "Evening, officer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Evening, license and registration, please." I handed them over, and he looked them over. "Everything seems in order. You know the guy in the Ford?" "No, sir, just saw him back at the diner." The officer nodded, handed back my documents, and walked back to his cruiser. As I pulled back onto the road, the Ford stayed put. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. But the feeling didn't last long. About 30 minutes later, I saw headlights in my mirror. It was the Ford, and it was gaining on me fast. My heart started to race. I floored the gas pedal, but a loaded semi doesn't exactly speed up quickly. The Ford pulled up alongside me, and I could see the man behind the wheel, his eyes wild and fixed on me. Suddenly, he swerved into my lane, hitting the side of my truck. The whole rig shuddered, and I fought to keep it on the road. He hit me again, harder this time, and I felt the trailer start to fishtail. I hit the brakes, hoping to slow down enough to regain control, but the Ford was relentless. He rammed me again, and this time the truck jackknifed, skidding across the highway and into the ditch. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I looked up just in time to see the man getting out of the Ford and walking toward me. He was holding something in his hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. I scrambled out of the cab and ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. I heard him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the pavement. I veered off the road and into the woods, branches whipping at my face as I ran. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept running. I stumbled over a fallen log and went down hard, my knee screaming in pain. I tried to get up, but it was no use. I could hear him getting closer. I reached for a branch, something, anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a rock, and I clutched it tightly. I could see his shadow moving through the trees, getting closer and closer. I held my breath, waiting for him to appear. When he did, I swung the rock with all the strength I had left. It connected with his head, and he stumbled but didn't go down. He grabbed me by the collar and lifted me off the ground. I could see his face now, twisted in a mask of rage. I swung the rock again, hitting him in the side of the head. This time he let go, and I fell to the ground. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I got up and ran, my knees screaming in protest with every step. I burst out of the woods and onto a dirt road. I looked around, trying to figure out which way to go. There were no lights, no signs of civilization, just darkness. I picked a direction and started running again, hoping I was going the right way. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. I stumbled toward them, waving my arms and shouting for help. The car slowed down and stopped, and I collapsed in front of it. A woman got out and ran over to me. "Oh my God, are you okay?" "No," I gasped. "There's a man. He's trying to kill me." She helped me into the car and sped off, calling 911 as we drove. We met the police about halfway back to the highway. They took my statement and went searching for the man, but they never found him. I quit driving after that. Took a job at a warehouse, something with regular hours and no travel. Every now and then I think I see him in a crowd or passing by in a car. I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but it doesn't make it any easier. I often think about that night, about how close I came to dying on a deserted highway. I think about the man who tried to kill me and wonder what made him do it. But most of all, I think about how lucky I am to be alive. In the months that followed, I tried to piece together what had happened. The police investigation turned up little. The Ford sedan was stolen, and there were no fingerprints, no leads. It was like the man had vanished into thin air. I kept to myself after that. The world felt different, more dangerous. I moved to a small town, took up gardening, and tried to find peace in the routine of everyday life. I met a woman named Linda, and we got married. She knew about what happened, but we didn't talk about it much. It was a shadow that lingered, but we built a life together despite it. Years went by, and the memory of that night began to fade. I still drove, but only locally. Linda and I bought a little house with a garden out back where I grew tomatoes and peppers. Life was good, but there was always a part of me that stayed on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One summer evening, we were having dinner on the porch when I heard a car pull up. It was a police cruiser. My heart skipped a beat as an officer got out and walked up to the house. He was young, probably new to the force. "Mr. McAllister?" he asked. "Yes, that's me. We found something you might want to see." I followed him to the station, my mind racing. They had found a body in the woods, not far from where my truck had crashed all those years ago. It was the man who had attacked me. He had a bullet wound in his chest and had been dead for a long time. The police figured he must have been shot by someone else, maybe another victim who had managed to escape. They couldn't identify him, and there were no missing persons reports that matched his description. I looked at the photos, the skeletal remains, and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I would never know who he was or why he had tried to kill me. But I knew he couldn't hurt anyone else. As I left the station, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The past was finally behind me. I went home to Linda, and we sat on the porch watching the sunset. I held her hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Life went on. I never did find out who the man was or why he had targeted me, but I learned to live with the uncertainty. I focused on the things that mattered: my family, my garden, the simple pleasures of everyday life. The experience had changed me, but it hadn't broken me, and in the end, that was enough. My name is Porter Withers, and this happened to me on April 17th, 1996. I was a truck driver back then, hauling freight across the country, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that lonely stretch of road in Idaho. I'd picked up a load in Spokane and was headed down to Boise. I liked driving nights, less traffic, cooler temps. The darkness was a blanket, and the hum of the tires on the asphalt was like a lullaby. I had my thermos of coffee and some Willie Nelson playing softly on the radio. Life was simple, and I was content. The trouble started just past Lewiston, where the road narrows and winds through some pretty rough terrain. It was close to midnight when I noticed a pair of headlights in my mirrors. They were far back at first, but they were closing in fast. I figured it was some impatient driver who'd pass me soon enough, but the headlights stayed on my tail, bright and blinding. I slowed down a bit, hoping they'd get the hint and go around. Instead, they stayed right there, almost riding my bumper. I started to get nervous. I'd heard stories about hijackings and robberies on these remote highways, and I wasn't keen on becoming another statistic. I reached over to the glove compartment and felt for the tire iron I kept there. I wasn't armed. Never felt the need for a gun, and besides, I didn't have the permits. But the tire iron was heavy and solid. It gave me a small measure of comfort. As I navigated a particularly sharp curve, The car behind me suddenly swerved out into the oncoming lane. For a moment, I thought they were finally going to pass, but then they cut back in, almost clipping my front end. I had to brake hard to avoid a collision, my truck skidding slightly on the gravel shoulder. The car pulled back behind me, headlights glaring. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't just some reckless driver, this was deliberate. I grabbed my CB radio and tried to raise anyone who might be in the area. Breaker, this is Big Red, calling for any drivers on Highway 95. Got a situation here, need some assistance. Over. Nothing but static. I tried again with the same result. Either there were no other drivers around or my signal was being jammed. I glanced in the mirror. The car was still there, relentless. Up ahead, I saw a small turnout, a rest area with a couple of picnic tables and a payphone. I decided to pull over, hoping that whoever was behind me would keep going. I signaled and eased my truck into the turnout, gravel crunching under the tires. The car followed me in and stopped a few yards behind. I cut the engine and climbed down from the cab, tire iron in hand. The night was eerily silent. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and ragged. The car's engine was still running, its headlights a blinding white. I couldn't see the driver through the glare. I took a step forward, then another. "Hey, what's your problem?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the emptiness. The driver's door opened slowly, and a man stepped out. He was tall, lean, dressed in dark clothes. I couldn't make out his face, but there was something about his stance that put me on edge. He didn't say a word, just stood there staring at me. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just move along, okay?" He took a step toward me, and I tightened my grip on the tire iron. My mind was racing. Why wasn't he speaking? What did he want? Before I could react, he lunged at me. I swung the tire iron, but he was fast, impossibly fast. He knocked it out of my hand and shoved me to the ground. Pain shot through my back as I hit the gravel. He was on me in an instant, his hands around my throat, squeezing. I kicked and struggled, but he was strong. Stronger than anyone I'd ever encountered. My vision started to blur, and I knew I was losing consciousness. I reached out blindly, my fingers closing around a rock. With the last of my strength, I swung it at his head. There was a sickening crunch, and his grip loosened. I pushed him off and scrambled to my feet, gasping for air. He was on the ground, clutching his head, blood seeping between his fingers. I didn't wait to see if he was getting up. I bolted for the payphone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The line rang once, twice, then connected. 911, what's your emergency? Help! I'm at a rest area off Highway 95. A man attacked me, he's hurt, but he might still be dangerous. Please, send someone quick. Stay on the line, sir. Officers are on their way. I glanced back at the car. The man was gone. Panic surged through me. Where had he gone? Was he coming for me again? I scanned the darkness, but there was no sign of him. Minutes felt like hours. I stayed on the line with the operator, my eyes darting around, trying to spot any movement. Finally, I saw the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car. Relief washed over me. 2 officers stepped out, hands on their holsters. I ran to meet them, still clutching the rock in my hand. "Sir, put the rock down," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. I dropped it, raising my hands. "He attacked me. He's around here somewhere." They moved cautiously, one checking the car while the other stayed with me. The car was empty. The man had vanished. They took my statement, and we searched the area, but there was no sign of him. No blood trail, no footprints. It was like he'd disappeared into thin air. They found my tire iron where I'd dropped it, but that was it. The officers escorted me back to my truck and advised me to continue to the nearest town, where I could file a more detailed report in the morning. I thanked them and climbed back into the cab, my hands still trembling. I drove to the next town, my eyes constantly checking the mirrors. Every pair of headlights made my heart race. When I finally reached a motel, I locked the door and pushed a chair against it before collapsing onto the bed, exhausted but too wired to sleep. The next morning, I went to the local sheriff's office and gave them a full account of what had happened. They took it seriously, but without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to keep an eye out and advised me to be cautious. I finished my delivery in Boise and then headed back to Spokane, taking a different route this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. For months after, I was jumpy. paranoid. Every time I saw a car behind me at night, my pulse quickened. I installed a dash cam, kept a baseball bat within reach, and even considered getting a gun, though I never did. I still drive that road occasionally, but I avoid stopping in remote areas. And every time I pass that rest area, I can't help but wonder what happened to that man. Was he just a random psycho, or was there more to it? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. But I'll tell you this, I'll never forget that night. It changed the way I look at the world, made me more cautious, more aware of the dangers lurking in the dark. So if you're ever driving down Highway 95 at night, keep your eyes open and your doors locked. You never know who might be out there, waiting. My name is Gideon Massey, and this happened to me on November 12th, 2015. I remember that day because it was the kind of bone-chilling cold that gets into your bones and makes you wish you'd never left the warmth of your bed. I was driving my rig through rural Ohio, a place where cornfields stretch out for miles and the only company you have is the occasional hawk circling overhead. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, ever since I got out of the Army. There's a certain freedom to the open road, but there's also a loneliness that can eat at you if you let it. On this particular trip, I was hauling a load of auto parts to a warehouse in Dayton. My route took me through a lot of back roads and small towns that time seems to have forgotten. My first stop was at a diner off Route 62. It was one of those places that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. I needed a break and a bite to eat, and besides, my truck could use a rest as well. I parked my rig and stepped inside. The place smelled of frying bacon and old coffee, which was oddly comforting. I ordered a burger and fries and took a seat at the counter. There was a guy sitting next to me, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked like he'd seen better days. Grimy clothes, a week's worth of stubble, and eyes that had a haunted look. He gave me a nod and I returned it. We started talking as you do. His name was Sam, and he was a trucker too, though he looked like he'd fallen on hard times. We swapped stories for a bit. He told me about his ex-wife and kid he hadn't seen in years, and I told him about my own family, my daughter, Sarah, who was in college, and my wife, Janet, who'd passed away a few years back. We talked about the road, the miles we'd logged, and the things we'd seen. After a while, Sam got up to leave. As he walked out, he paused at the door and looked back at me. "Be careful out there, man," he said. "There's some bad stuff going on these days." I nodded, not thinking much of it. Truckers tend to be a superstitious lot, always hearing rumors and urban legends. I finished my meal, paid the check, and headed back to my truck. I had about 5 hours of driving ahead of me, so I settled in and got back on the road. The day passed uneventfully enough. I listened to some classic rock, smoked a few cigarettes, and watched the world go by. The sun was starting to set when I noticed the fuel gauge was getting low. I figured I'd stop at the next gas station I saw. That's when things started to get weird. I was driving along a particularly desolate stretch of road when I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder. There was a woman standing next to it, waving her arms. I slowed down and pulled over. It's not uncommon to come across people in need of help, and I always try to lend a hand when I can. As I got out of the truck, I noticed something off. The woman was dressed in a thin sweater and jeans, totally inappropriate for the cold. She looked scared, her eyes wide and darting around. "Hey there, you need some help?" I called out. She nodded frantically. "My car broke down and my phone's dead. Can you give me a lift to the next town?" I hesitated for a moment. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me, but I shrugged it off. "Sure, hop in." She climbed into the passenger seat and I got back behind the wheel. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the tires on the road. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just the next town," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was something in her tone that made me uneasy. I glanced over at her and noticed she was clutching her hands together tightly, her knuckles white. I decided to keep my questions to myself and focus on the road. We drove for about 20 minutes before we reached a small gas station. I pulled in and parked next to the pump. "Here we are," I said. "You can call for help from here." She nodded and quickly got out of the truck, almost running inside. I watched her go, still feeling uneasy. I filled up the tank and went inside to pay. The clerk behind the counter was a grizzled old man with a cigarette hanging from his lips. He looked up as I approached. "Help you?" he asked. "Yeah, just need to pay for the gas," I said. As I handed him the cash, I glanced around the store. The woman was nowhere to be seen. "Hey, did you see a woman come in here just now?" I asked. The clerk shook his head. "Ain't seen nobody but you." A cold knot formed in my stomach. I quickly paid for the gas and walked back out to my truck. The woman was gone. I looked around the parking lot, but there was no sign of her. I got back in the truck and sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she just run off? Why? And why did the clerk lie about seeing her? I decided to put it out of my mind and get back on the road. I still had a few hours to go before I reached Dayton, and I wanted to get there before it got too late. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman's face staring back at me. I finally reached the warehouse in Dayton around midnight. I parked the truck and went inside to check in with the night manager, Frank. He was a big, burly guy with a no-nonsense attitude. "Evening, Frank," I said as I handed him the paperwork. "Evening, Gideon. Long haul?" he asked, glancing over the forms. "Yeah, you could say that. Had a strange encounter on the way here, though," I said, recounting the story of the woman on the side of the road. Frank listened, his expression growing more serious with each word. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "That's creepy, man. You hear about that stuff, but you never think it'll happen to you." I nodded. "Yeah, it was definitely weird. Anyway, the truck's all yours. I'm gonna grab some sleep before I head back out." Frank gave me a pat on the back. "Take care, Gideon, and watch your back out there." I found a cheap motel nearby and checked in. The room was small and dingy, but I was too tired to care. I collapsed onto the bed and fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to hit the road before the sun was fully up. I had another delivery to make, and I wanted to get a head start. As I was loading up the truck, I noticed a piece of paper stuck under the windshield wiper. I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting. "He's watching you." My blood ran cold. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I quickly crumpled the note and shoved it into my pocket. I finished loading up and got back on the road, my mind racing. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every car that passed by seemed suspicious, every shadow on the side of the road a potential threat. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. About an hour into my drive, I noticed a car that seemed to be tailing me. It was a beat-up old sedan, keeping a steady distance behind me. I changed lanes a few times, but it stayed with me. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to lose this guy. I took the next exit and pulled into a rest area. The car followed. I parked my truck and watched as the sedan pulled into a spot a few rows back. I could see the driver now, a man in his 30s with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I decided to confront him. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and got out of the truck. As I approached the car, the driver's door opened and the man stepped out. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and empty. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw the glint of metal in his hand. He had a knife. I backed up quickly, my heart racing. "Look, I don't want any trouble." He still didn't say anything. Instead, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react. I swung the flashlight at his head, but he ducked and slashed at me with the knife. I felt a sharp pain in my side as the blade cut through my jacket. I stumbled back, clutching my side. The man advanced, his knife gleaming in the dim light. I knew I had to do something or I was a goner. I looked around and saw a piece of broken glass on the ground. I grabbed it and swung it at him, catching him on the arm. He let out a grunt of pain and dropped the knife. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the knife and plunged it into his chest. He gasped, his eyes widening in shock. I pulled the knife out and stabbed him again and again until he collapsed to the ground. I stood there panting and covered in blood. I couldn't believe what I had just done. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I quickly got back into my truck and drove off, my hands shaking. I drove for hours, not sure where I was going. I just needed to get away. Finally, I pulled into a truck stop and parked in the far corner of the lot. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I realized I needed to call the police. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. I just killed a man, I said, my voice shaking. The operator took down my information and sent a patrol car to my location. When the officers arrived, I told them everything. They took my statement and brought me in for questioning. It turned out the man I killed was a wanted criminal, responsible for a string of murders and disappearances along the highways. The woman I had picked up was one of his victims who had managed to escape. In the end, they ruled it as self-defense, and I was released. But the experience left a scar that would never fully heal. I still think about that night, about the cold, empty eyes of the man who tried to kill me, and about the woman who disappeared without a trace. Life on the road continued, but I was never the same. I became more cautious, more wary of strangers. The open road that once felt like freedom now felt like a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. But I keep driving, because that's what I do. And every now and then, I think about Sam, the trucker I met at the diner. I wonder if he knew something I didn't, if he had his own brush with the darkness that haunts the highways. And I wonder if someday I'll run into him again, and we can share our stories over a cup of coffee, and maybe, just maybe, find some peace in knowing we're not alone.